Welcome back to Geologic Time. Last time we looked at this two-tiered system of columns for the geologic timescale. On the left, we have all of Earth history starting at 4.6 billion years ago and going up to the present. And then on the right, we have blown up the most recent eon known as the Phanerozoic, which is divided into three eras: the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And so we started to take a look at these different eras, and now we're going to investigate them a little bit further. We're going to start with the Paleozoic Era. So the Paleozoic Era is that time right after the Cambrian explosion when the fossil record became abundant worldwide with all kinds of preserved fossils. Shells, teeth eventually, all became preserved. Remember, there was life before the Cambrian explosion, but it was soft tissue life mostly, and that's very difficult to preserve. Things like algae are not very easy to preserve in the geologic record. So we started out with invertebrates, and invertebrates are organisms that do not have a backbone. So you can think of things like tube worms, sponges. Down here in this picture, we have some trilobites, which are sort of like those little roly-polies, those little bugs that you see and you touch and they make themselves into a little sphere. Although these were much bigger. This picture here is just kind of a cartoon showing what some of these invertebrates might have looked like, and there's a diver's shadow in here just to show the scale of the size of these organisms. So not somewhere I would want to be swimming. Other examples of invertebrates would be ancestors of lobsters and squid and things like that. Next on the scene were the fishes, and the fishes were of course very important because they were vertebrates. And so we evolved from invertebrate to vertebrate organisms. Of course, remember, this took tens of millions of years. And any of you who have ever eaten a whole fish know quite well that there is indeed a backbone in a fish. So the fish came along in the early Cambrian, but really the Ordovician is kind of known as the age of the fishes. Skipping up a bit because there's way too much to talk about in this little video. Another crucial group of animals that came along were the amphibians. Amphibians live both in the water and on land. And this was evidence that animals were leaving the ocean. In these earlier times down here, everything was living in the ocean. And this is a rendition of a fossil that was called a lobe-finned fish. And the idea is that this fish seemed to have a lobe where a fin would normally be that appeared to be maybe an ancestral lung. So we know that fish in the ocean respirate through their gills, and animals on land respirate through lungs. And so this might be an organism that was marking that transition from a gill to a lung, thus indicating the emergence of animals from the water to land. Another thing you'll notice is this stubby little appendage here, and that looks like a fin that maybe now is actually being used to mobilize the organism along the land. So amphibians were important. Seed-bearing plants, once things came onto the land, are called gymnosperms, and here's an example of what that might have looked like. Now, this time period here has two sort of names. One is the Carboniferous, which is a name used in most of the world for this geologic time period. And then in the US, we've actually divided it into the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. But no matter where you are in the world during this time period, this is a time when there seem to be a lot of coal deposits formed. And coal deposits often form in situations like this picture here, where you have a lot of plants in a swampy type of environment where the plants die and are buried under the water, under the mud very quickly. And as they get further and further buried and heated up, they turn into coal eventually. And so that's where the derivation of the word carbon is in this word. And then you're probably familiar that we have a lot of coal in Pennsylvania. So that's where those words come from. Another thing that was kind of cool is the appearance of winged insects. Now, insects actually came along in the Silurian down here, but insects that flew were around in Pennsylvania. And some of them had wingspans of 2 meters. This is what it might have looked like in the early Paleozoic if you went diving in the ocean. At the end of the Paleozoic, mass extinction. And so what is a mass extinction? Well, it's a worldwide disappearance, as seen in the fossil record, of a large percentage of species in a short period of time. And by short period of time, we mean geologically, so in probably less than 1 million years. The Permian extinction, which was at the end of the Paleozoic, and it's named Permian because that was the last geologic period, was the largest ever observed. And again, it's observed worldwide. 70% of land vertebrate species disappeared, as did 90 to 95% of marine species. So this mass extinction is sometimes called the Permian extinction. And now I can mention a little bit about these other breaks between the various periods, because this extinction was a big break between the eras, Paleozoic and Mesozoic. These other little breaks sometimes are represented by smaller extinction events. For example, between the Cambrian and the Ordovician, there were some species that went extinct, there were new species that came on the scene, and this was seen worldwide, but it was not necessarily a massive high percentage of species that changed. And so many of these boundaries have very odd numbers, such as 440 million years ago or 359 million years ago. And that's why. They aren't chosen to be regularly incremented, they're selected because those happen to be the times when these events occurred. Let's move on to the Mesozoic. Now, of course, the Mesozoic is known as the time of the dinosaurs. And reptiles and dinosaurs were actually on the scene in the late Paleozoic, but in the Mesozoic, they really took over. Mammals also showed up on the scene, and we are mammals, and there are lots and lots of kinds of mammals. But in the Mesozoic, mammals mostly remained pretty small, and they did not explode into the huge variety we have today until after the dinosaurs went extinct. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So what is a mammal? Put the video on pause and see if you can jot down the 4 requirements for something to be a mammal. All right, I will tell you. They have to be warm-blooded. They have to give live birth, okay, no laying eggs. They have to have hair or fur, and they suckle their young. Now, what was this first mammal like? Get ready. They say it was like a shrew. And here's a modern shrew. So, there's our great ancestral grandparents. All of ours, right? We all came from the same shrew, I guess. Anyway, birds came along in the Mesozoic. In the Jurassic, birds evolved from dinosaurs. And then in terms of plants on the land, flowering plants came along. Again, if you've seen these Jurassic Park movies, you can see that they've tried to make the land look like it would in the Mesozoic. Really though, the Mesozoic was all about these guys. And in case you didn't guess, the end of the Mesozoic is marked by another mass extinction event. This one is called the KT extinction. So why do we call it the KT extinction? Well, over here I have part of that geologic time scale. I've got a bit of the Paleozoic and then the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. And the period right before this extinction event, which is right here between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, is the Cretaceous. And in geology, we use a K to abbreviate Cretaceous because C is used for Cambrian. And then here it says Paleogene, and here I'm telling you that Tertiary is the first period in the Cenozoic. And this is because things have changed. It used to be that the first geologic period in the Cenozoic was called the Tertiary, and it included all of this time up to 2.6 million years ago, and then the Quaternary was the second geologic period. However, the Tertiary is now divided into these 2 other periods, Neogene and Paleogene. So don't be confused by that. In any case, the Tertiary is represented by T, and so this boundary was called the KT boundary, or the KT extinction. And during this extinction, we lost 40% of all species, of course, including the dinosaurs. Coming up next, we'll finally get to our era, the Cenozoic.